The elections are over. Long live the elections. Midterm primary season officially wrapped up this week with elections in Florida and Alaska, where Democrats are making major pushes to overturn seats in the House and the Senate in states where Republicans have turned politics into machines. We're going to take a quick stop in South Carolina, too, today, where there's a runoff race in the Republican side between a sitting congressman and the sister of the late Senator Lindsey Graham. And, well, it's going about as well as you expect. Finally, the U.S. is having some money troubles. We blew by a massive national debt mile marker with no signs of slowing down, and the plan might actually be to make things worse. I promise, though, there will be no math on this exam, so just hang in there with me. It's Thursday, August 20th, 2026. Welcome to Make It Make Sense. I'm Grant Herms. This is it. Today is the very last day to get in on the Make It Make Sense anniversary subscription deal. You have until midnight tonight to become a paid subscriber at the original launch price of $5 a month or $50 a year. That gets you access to things you forgot from civics class, the weekly original reporting like this week's, where I spent days tracking down a fake polling firm that ran what it called a social experiment on voters in Wisconsin, Nevada, and Los Angeles. It's a story about lies, bad polling, and our worst impulses. Paid subscribers also get access to the full archive of podcast episodes, Make It Make Nonsense, and Too Long Tuned Out. You can get in on that deal at makeitmakesense.substack.com or head to the link in the show notes. All right, let's get on with the show. Tuesday night marked the end of the primaries. We finally made it, folks, just in time to get ready for the general election, which is now 75 days away. But before we can officially look ahead at November, we have to bookend our primaries, kind of literally. Florida and Alaska are where we end, and there were some very big races in those states. In Alaska, there's a race for a Senate seat that Democrats were not expecting to be competitive in, and now they are. Alaska has a nonpartisan ranked choice voting primary, sometimes called a jungle primary, which is where voters rank their top candidates in order. And really quickly, just so you know how this works, in most cases, I should say too, if no one candidate gets a majority of the vote, then the last place candidate gets eliminated. If you voted for them as one of your top choices, then that vote goes to the next candidate up on your ballot until all the ballots are winnowed down to a single candidate. You can think of that as like an instant runoff. Now, in some states like Alaska or California, there's an earlier cutoff than 50%, so the top two vote getters move on to the general election regardless of their party. So you could have a Democrat against a Democrat or a Republican versus a Republican, ranked choice voting, don't care. I've had a lot of conversations about this kind of a thing with folks on the show from organizations like Fair Vote, who have explained that in a lot better and more detail. So if you want that, go check those out. Moving on. In Alaska, the primary has now shook out to be former Democratic Congresswoman Mary Peltola against sitting Republican Senator Dan Sullivan, with Peltola getting more overall votes than Sullivan, which was unexpected. Alaska is considered a Republican stronghold, but it's also sort of the weird cousin at the Republican family reunion. The state party doesn't quite fit the mold of the current Republican Party, and voters in Alaska aren't your typical Republicans because nothing about living in Alaska is typical. The irony aside that you can draw a pretty straight line from Alaska to Donald Trump, because without Alaskan Governor Sarah Palin becoming John McCain's running mate in 2008, the wing of the party that becomes MAGA probably doesn't get into the water supply as fast or as potently. Probably. That being said, Mary Peltola isn't a normal Democrat either. She was considered one of the least loyal Democrats in the House, frequently voting against environmental bills and voting to criticize Joe Biden, but Democrats would prefer her to any Republican in that seat. Senator Dan Sullivan has an approval rating that averages in the high 30% range, and according to a survey put out last month, he was the third least liked senator in the country, behind Mitch McConnell and Susan Collins in Maine. There was also this weird thing in this race where another guy named Dan J. Sullivan ran in the primary as a Republican, and now the DOJ has opened a grand jury investigation into whether Dan J. Sullivan got into the race to purposely confuse voters, which isn't really a crime, not really. So I don't know what they're going after here, but whatever, we'll keep an eye on that. On the other end of the country, Florida. The races there were also wild, specifically a congressional race and the Democratic primary for Senate. The congressional race worth knowing about in Florida is for the soon-to-be former Representative Cory Mills' seat. Mills has been in Congress for a few terms now, and along the way has racked up a long list of scandals. Chief among them is that he allegedly assaulted his former girlfriend, a former Miss USA, which prompted a judge to issue a restraining order, the D.C. police to launch an investigation, and the House Ethics Committee to launch a probe of their own. He was accused of obtaining a Bronze Star through stolen valor, and he's currently under investigation by the Department of Justice, which has also obtained thousands of documents on him and his arms-dealing company that allege he's been using his position in Congress to cut sweetheart deals for himself and his arms-dealing friends to keep his business afloat. Trump gave Mills his complete and total endorsement back in February, but on Tuesday said actually he told Mills to drop out of the race even though he considers Mills his friend. Again, a guy accused of domestic assault and illegal arms dealing. Mills was also pretty roundly disliked by his fellow members of Congress, too. He's an ass. So I'm not sure anyone is going to be sad that he's gone. He'll be replaced as the Republican on the ballot by a former TV news reporter, and that has made the seat a little less likely to be Republican, but it's still very likely to stay under GOP control. The really big news out of Florida was in the Democratic Senate primary, where the Democratic Socialist movement notched their first statewide primary win with State Representative Angela Nixon. It's kickstarted a whole news cycle of panic among establishment Democrats who didn't think a DSA candidate could win in a statewide race anywhere, let alone a state as red as Florida, which also has one of the strongest Republican parties in the country. It was a huge upset for Nixon, who pledged not to take any corporate or PAC money. She ran a very kind of old-school grassroots campaign and beat out Alexander Vindman, who you might remember from Trump's first term as one of the witnesses who gave testimony in Trump's first impeachment hearings about his attempt to extort Ukraine in 2019. He's also the twin brother of Virginia Congressman Eugene Vindman. Alex Vindman outraised Nixon by 16-1 in this race. But he was also what's called a carpetbagger in political terms. It's not a friendly term. Someone who moves to a new state to try to win a race because they can't win in their home state. Voters don't tend to like those folks very much. Nixon also made a big name for herself in Florida this year by leading the fight against Republican-led redistricting, which splits the black vote and nets Republicans somewhere between 5 to 7 new seats in Congress. She was known for wielding a big pink megaphone while she was in office and speaking in the legislature. She led sit-ins in the governor's office and then got arrested for doing that for trespassing and non-violently resisting arrest, which is like one of those charges that officers tack on for a bit of flavor, you know? So she goes to a jury trial next month for those charges, while she'll also be running for Senate, which will be wild to watch. Okay, really quickly, let's go to South Carolina, where there's a runoff election happening for who will be the Republican on the ballot to replace Lindsey Graham, who died a few weeks ago. That race is between Congressman Ralph Norman and Graham's sister, who was appointed to his seat to the end of his term, Darlene Graham. Now, Norman has bucked Trump a few times, but really, he's voted for what Trump wants 95.33% of the time. According to the GOP's own scorecard tracker, they actually calculate the loyalty to the president down to the decimal place because that's how much the president demands loyalty. If you're 0.2 off your loyalty score, it could cost you. And it certainly has for Norman because Trump endorsed Darlene Graham. Now, I have talked about her before. She's not an elected public official. She doesn't have a ton of experience, but she sits on a few statewide and quasi-national agencies and organizations, mostly doing work for the blind, and then does some other disability work. She was given this temporary senatorship out of a long-standing sort of courtesy to her brother, not on her credentials, and on Tuesday night at a debate against Norman, Graham was asked about one of the most important national security partnerships the U.S. has and said this.
Are Taiwan and the South China Sea national security issues for the United States? If so, why?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
Are Taiwan and the South China Sea national security issues for the United States, and if so, why or how?
I'm just going to be honest here. I'm not on national security. I'm not that informed on national security, so...
Okay, so, hey, it's never fun to get booed. And she got flustered and is very clearly out of her depth on stage, but also the answer to that question should have been a very easy yes. It's been the U.S. position over what's going on in the South China Sea for a long time. It's been U.S. policy that we support Taiwanese independence since 1979. China claims Taiwan is part of its country. The U.S. says not so fast, and we've had this little standoff that's chilled by all of the trade that we do. If Taiwan is retaken by China, that opens the door for China to move against our allies like South Korea or Japan, or gives the go-ahead for a country like North Korea to do something very stupid. So, yeah, Taiwan and the South China Sea are national security issues, which was the question. Not, is this a threat? Just, is it an issue? And it does not seem like this is going to go well for Darlene Graham. Now, there are two things with this, too. The latest Republican poll to come out of the South Carolina race had Graham up by 7 points over Norman. Remember, primary polls, though, are often wrong because it's hard to poll them, so we really won't know until next Tuesday whether that holds, because that's when this runoff primary is. But this was not a good outing for Trump's pick, whom he is going to campaign for tomorrow on Friday in person, which is weird given the other major races happening around the country that he could be going to go give his support to. The other thing to know here is that this race is being watched very closely because the Democratic candidate Annie Andrews was beating Lindsey Graham by 3 points before he died, and she was leading or tied with every other GOP candidate in the race before Darlene Graham was appointed, so the winner of this Republican runoff is going to have a huge fight on their hands to keep a seat that Republicans did not expect to have to fight. And while, yes, money will pour in behind whomever the GOP candidate is, it's hard to convince voters to vote for you after they've already booed for you. Okay, let's take a break. After that, the national debt soars past a marker we didn't think we'd break, and the administration does not know what's happening. I've found something that I need to stay sane in all this chaos is going to the gym. I go to the Kronk gym here in Detroit. If you're into boxing, that might mean something to you. If not, it's really just an excuse to hit something and, to get a workout in. But I also like to drink a protein shake afterwards to make sure that I'm staying healthy. I have spent years suffering through the worst kinds of protein shakes. Chalky, thick, it's like drinking wet cement. It's just awful. It's honestly worse than the workout. It's why I recently switched to Clear Protein. That's Clear with a K. It's a clear whey protein. They've got 2 great flavors right now, strawberry watermelon and wild blue raspberry. This stuff tastes like a juice drink instead of a milkshake gone wrong, you know what I mean? And it's not skimping to get there either. 20 grams of protein, no sugar, no lactose, so no bloat, and no tummy troubles if that's a problem for you, and you already know that's a deal breaker. If this sounds like something that you want after your workout, you can get your hands on a 20% off code right now. You can use MIMS25 at checkout. And full disclosure, I do get a cut of this commission, but you'll be helping out the show too and getting some great tasting protein for after your workout. Again, that's Clear Protein with a K. Use MIMS25 at checkout because drinking your protein shake shouldn't be the hardest part of your workout. All right, let's get back to the show. This week, the U.S. national debt smashed through a ceiling that no one is all that happy about. We passed $40 trillion in debt. That is doubled in the last decade. I'll explain why in just a second, but for a little bit of economic baseline on this, how this works is the U.S. spends more than we take in on things like defense spending, overall wars, tax cuts, and social safety nets, especially during the pandemic, and then the rest of the things that keep the U.S. government running. To make up the difference, we sell pieces of our economy, we'll say, but basically, we sell pieces of the difference between what we take in and what we need. And we sell that to other countries. They hold on to those in agreements and bonds, and then we pay that back little by little. Theoretically, those countries could call in all of that debt whenever they wanted, but they won't. In fact, normally economists will tell you that the U.S. debt isn't actually an issue because no one on Earth thinks the U.S. isn't good for the money. Why? Because we're the planet's economy. We're what it's tied to, because the U.S. dollar is the standard for the global economy. It's called the reserve currency. We're tied to shipping, trade, defense guarantees, diplomatic treaties. The dollar is the universal language of the business world. The problem is, the higher the debt out there, the harder it is for the government to handle its problems in here at home. Prices go up because inflation does, because interest rates go up, because the U.S. dollar is worth less, because there's more debt against it out in the world. Follow me? Cool. It is important to stress, again, that the debt doubled in size in the last 10 years. Yes, the pandemic was bad and did some of that work, but really, economists are now pointing to two things that drove the debt here: Trump's 2017 tax cut and the Republican presidential legacy of high deficit-to-debt ratio, which means how much debt we pay back annually versus how much more debt did we bring in each year. And under every Republican president going back to 1980, Republicans have spent more and paid back less, generally harming the overall economy. And then Democratic presidents have come in and made up the difference, and voters have then put Republicans back in office. Now, that's not my actual opinion. That's economic numbers, and from people much smarter on this stuff than me. The economist Dean Baker at the Center for Economic Policy and Research wrote today, whatever we think of debt and deficits, there is one point that should be very clear. It has been run up almost entirely due to Republican tax cuts and their inept management of the economy. So what does that mean for us as regular people? Well, we've already been seeing it. Prices are higher. People are struggling to get financing for things like cars and homes and business loans. And despite paying our taxes, we're getting less and less from the government that should be providing us services. The real problem is the White House has shown both that it doesn't know how to solve this problem and might not really want to. In fact, they might want to make it worse. A few weeks ago, the U.S. spent a bunch of money to prop up the Japanese yen, their dollar. Don't worry about the international monetary particulars of how that works, but their economy is starting to get all wobbly because of the war in Iran blocking the flow of oil, among other things. Japan holds a lot of U.S. debt, and if they all of a sudden needed money to stay above water, they could call in our debt, leaving us in a much tougher spot. And then just yesterday, the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent started directing the department to take a much more interventionist position on buying back U.S. bonds from around the world. That just means a much more aggressive position. Usually, though, the government would stay out of this kind of thing, but he's hoping this will help stabilize some of the uncertainty around whether the U.S. is going to stay in good standing. Now, if that kind of thing sounds like something that, if a Democrat did it, Fox News hosts would hurt themselves sprinting to hit their combination socialism, communism, Taco Bell button, you're right. But that is for a different day. And this may sound like something that is outlandish, but that's not true. The problem with what Bessent is doing isn't that it's new. The U.S. did this kind of thing in 2008 to stop some of the bleeding in the financial crisis. The issue is that Bessent doesn't know how to do it, or doesn't seem like he does. Today, he straight up said he doesn't understand the global oil economy, which is tied directly to the things he's been doing.
We've got a spike in oil prices today that I don't really understand. Our announcement is for economic action, and I think that the economic action will mean that oil prices will come down sooner.
Not great, Scott. But then there's the other part of this, that the administration might not even want to fix this debt problem. In fact, it seems like they might want to clip the wrong wire on the ticking time bomb to make it go faster, kind of a thing. So last week, the president said after the war in Iran is won, which leave that aside, he's going to declare the Strait of Hormuz a U.S. territory.
Pretty soon I'll be declaring the Hormuz Strait a territory of the United States. Essentially, that's what it is. We have the blockade. No ships get through unless we want them to.
Yeah, that's against international law. Even our Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, agrees.
This is an international waterway. Okay, this is an international waterway. And international law is very clear. And I love it because everybody always talks about international law. And this international law on this is very clear. International waterways, no country can control them.
what he said. So it can't happen for legal reasons. It would also just become a shooting gallery for Iran in the Strait of Hormuz, which would make it one of the worst trade routes in the world. And even if all of that happened anyway, which it won't, but if it did, it would set off an ownership race for the world's most important shipping straits and upset what's been the international norm of ocean trade since World War II. What I mean by that is since the end of World War II, the U.S. has more or less guaranteed free and open shipping and trade on the high seas as long as that trade is done using the dollar. It's what makes our currency king. If we end that by illegally laying claim to the Strait of Hormuz, it means that other countries could start forcing their currencies to be used at key through routes, like the Chinese yuan would be used in the Panama Canal or the pound in the English Channel. And then all of a sudden, global trade breaks down and countries start calling in U.S. debt that they're holding to prop up their economies because they can't figure out how to make trade work the way it used to. At the same time, JD Vance has started saying he thinks the U.S. should pull back from being the global currency of the world, that reserve currency, even without taking the Strait of Hormuz. Here he was last week talking to a group of young Republicans.
I am not sure that I think the reserve currency is actually good for the United States of America. I think there is a good argument that reserve currency status is akin to coal in Appalachia. It's a resource curse, right? It allows your consumers to consume very cheaply, right? That's been the story of the American economy for the last 15 or so years. Even before that, is we can just borrow basically in an unlimited way because we have the reserve currency.
So what he's saying there is the U.S. has had it too good for too long, and we should make things a little bit harder for ourselves to, I don't know what, appreciate what we have by crashing the economy. I honestly don't know what the aim is on that, but it's been a favorite line of Vance's for a long time, and a very similar one to his mentor and bankroller Peter Thiel, who was a Silicon Valley guy who last year couldn't answer whether he thought humanity as a species should survive. So, we should definitely trust that dude's ideas. Now, listen, I hear you. You don't come to this show for money talk. I get it. But this is stuff that you should be able to make some sense of, because if the White House is not going to change course, it means that we are inevitably going to be paying more and more for longer. And the longer that goes on, the longer we risk something really, really big and really, really bad happening with the economy right when most Americans need it the least. Okay, that is it for today's episode. I think that's a good place to call it because I threw a lot at you here. Please rate and review the show wherever you get your podcasts. This is, again, the last day to become a paid subscriber to the Make It Make Sense Substack for the launch price of just $5 a month or $50 for a year. After midnight tonight, it goes up to $7 a month or $7 a year. That's about $1 an episode. Either way, you can head to makeitmakesense.substack.com to get that deal right now. And as always, share the show on social media. Tag me at Grant Herms on Twitter, Blue Sky, and the Say So News app, and at Grant_Herms on everything else. Thank you so much for listening today. I'm Grant Herms, and I'll talk to you next time.